Okay, so I think now that most people are here and settled in, I'm going to get us going and introduce our speaker today. It is my pleasure, deep, sincere pleasure, to introduce Professor Ann Cahill from Elon University in the philosophy department. Dr. Cahill earned her BA from Holy Cross and her PhD from SUNY Stony Brook, or now it's Stony Brook University. Her first book, Women on the Hill, she wrote after finishing her undergraduate degree, something that you can all aspire to before starting graduate school. And in this book, she interviewed alumna of Holy Cross since coeducation. In her second book, Rethinking Rape, she critiqued the two dominant schools of thought regarding sexual violence and feminism, and offered an analysis of the embodied meanings of rape. And her most recent book, Overcoming Objectification, A Carnal Ethics, her argument here is, we're objects and there's nothing wrong with it. If you've read some of the literature, that's a surprising take on it. Recently, she won the Elon's Distinguished Scholar Award in 2011, and she's lucky that she no longer has to be the chair of the philosophy department, but she is the former chair. And I have known Anne, it will be this fall, 20 years, which I just figured out, which is crazy to me. So, with no further ado, I will introduce Dr. Ann Cahill, and her talk today is Recognition, Desire, and Unjust Sex. And by the way, thank you for all coming out on this incredibly blustery day. This is very impressive. Thank you.
Indeed. Philosophy is known as a leisure activity. So we should all feel very proud and we have to fight a little bit to do it, because usually it only happens once you are comfortable to a certain degree. I'm going to wander a lot. In fact, I think I'm going to start off by wandering. So especially you people in the back, start making noise if you can't hear me. I have a paper and I'm going to use a little bit as an anchor, but I don't like to read. I like to talk. Philosophy is about thinking with people. And I'm going to try to leave a lot of time for questions. And part of the impetus for my talk is not only to talk about rape, sexual violence, normative heterosex, desire, sexology, there's a lot of stuff going on. But it's also to represent something about philosophical scholarship, because I'm really going to start off by summarizing a conversation that happened among scholars that I'm part of, and to sort of give a representation of how philosophical scholarship works. It's very slow, first of all. Philosophers I like to think of as very slow in general. Other people can have conversations and they trip happily along and philosophers go, whoa, 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 what do you mean by women? We stop before other people stop. And we slow everything way down. Philosophical scholarship is slow too. So I'm going to talk today about responding to a critic of mine. As Dr. Hansen said, back in 2001, I wrote a book called Rethinking Rape, and I criticized two main schools of feminist thought on rape. And I'll summarize them here for you. The first one, which is really filtered down into our mainstream society, was articulated first by Susan Brown Miller. And that's the line that says, sexual violence is not about sex, it's about power. Okay, we've probably heard this, right? It's not about sexuality, it's not about being turned on, it's not about whether you're wearing appealing clothing, it's about power, it's about dominance, it's about violence. That's what Susan Brown Miller. Very important articulation. Has some really important, although I think ultimately not always positive legal ramifications, but crucial moment in women's studies in general. Okay, then Catherine McKinnon comes along and she says, no, not so much with that. It's really primarily about sex. It's about phallocentric, heterocentric, compulsory heterosexuality. The violence is really very comparable to the coercion that all heterosexuality is marked by. So she had a very different uptake. I argue that both of them were wrong. That's what we do. And then they were philosophically flawed, particularly in their understandings of bodies and power and sexuality. As an alternative to these theories, I wanted to look at rape as an embodied experience using a bunch of conceptual tools from contemporary feminist theory. A bunch of things of understanding the body as central to subjectivity, the body as marked by difference. And I hoped that would help illuminate some of the harms of sexual violence and not fall into some of the pitfalls that Brown and McKinnon did. So, philosophical research is slow. And now people are starting to respond to rethinking rape in really some very helpful ways, some not so helpful. One really helpful critique came from a psychologist by the name of Nicola Gay. She wrote a very theoretically informed book that criticized a couple of the comments that I made in Rethinking Rape. And that's going to be the impetus for this. I want to show a couple things about Gaby's work. One, and this is, I emphasize this point because Gaby herself doesn't make it. I want to argue that Gaby is reanimating the McKinnon position. The weird thing is she never mentions McKinnon. I don't know why. I'm going to meet her soon and I will ask her. But she never says that she's doing it. But as far as I can tell, she has done some of the heavy lifting that McKinnon hasn't done. And therefore, she gets to reanimate McKinnon's position in a way that protects it from all the critiques that I and other people have made about McKinnon. I mean, that takes some doing. And it's really, really very helpful. So I want to show that Gaby is resonating with McKinnon. I'm going to have to sort of do some work to show that because Gaby doesn't do it herself. And then I want to argue that in taking up Gaby's point, it has to make us think more critically about the role of sexual desire in sexual ethics. Okay? I want to ask the question, and I can't go into this part of the thinking too quickly, but we can do it in the question and answer. I want to say, look, feminist theory has pretty much shown that consent is not a really good way of determining whether a sexual interaction is ethical or not. It doesn't work for a variety of reasons. I know it's all in our law, it's in our policies, but there's a lot of reasons why it doesn't work very well. So I'm going to ask the question, hey, please desire instead. Rather than saying, does someone consent to this sexual interaction? And just think about what kinds of things you consent to. Surgery. Dangerous activities that might kill you. It's kind of weird that we think about sex in that way. Not to mention that we never think about men consenting to sex. That's another problem. So I want to say, maybe we can say, did both people want to have sex? Maybe that's what makes it ethically acceptable. As it turns out, it's not going to work too well. But then I'm going to say that there is an ethical role for desire. Okay, so let's start quickly by talking a little bit about McKinnon. And just revisiting quickly her argument, which was mostly shown in her book, Towards a Feminist Theory of the State. So McKinnon's main point is, look, you can't talk about rape as sex without the consent. Because we live in a political structure of compulsory heterosexuality. That is, women particularly are compelled to be heterosexual. There's a lot of penalties if you're not. You must express your heterosexuality consistently, even to people who should be indifferent to it. And therefore, you're not only engaged to appear heterosexual, you're not only you're compelled to engage in heterosexual practices. Also, McKinnon points out that dominance and eroticism are intertwined in hegemonic heterosexuality. That part of what heterosexuality is eroticized dominance. So in that sense, sex is, right, paradigmatically heterosexual sex. Okay, so that's a problem. If heterosexuality itself is grounded in a lack of consent, it's not like women get to choose from a sexual smorgasbord of identities, right? It's weighted. Then it seems quite foolish from McKinnon's perspective to distinguish between those interactions that have consent and those that don't. Consent only becomes a relevant factor if it's really possible to withhold consent. And in a culture where compulsory heterosexuality is so rigidly enforced, McKinnon finds it disingenuous at best and downright dangerous at worst to fool ourselves into thinking that most heterosexual sex is consensual and that just there are a few outliers that involve coercion, violence, some form of non-consensual act. So if consent, and McKinnon agrees with this, if consent can't do the job of distinguishing rape from normal heterosexual intercourse, neither for McKinnon can desire, precisely because women are constructed as sexual beings who find dominance and aggression sexually appealing. That's McKinnon's definition of a woman. It's playing this role where one's subordination is eroticized. Okay, so the theoretical upshot of McKinnon's analysis of the institution of heterosexuality is that the institution is ineluctably hostile to the possibility of female sexual subjectivity and autonomy. It's a paradox for McKinnon to talk about women freely choosing heterosexuality. To be a heterosexual woman is always and already to be implicated into a tightly woven set of discourses that pits one own constructed, because patriarchy teaches women to like to be dominated. So you put your own constructed desires against your interests for freedom, for autonomy, and bodily integrity. So the meaning for rape for McKinnon is not that it is distinct from other heterosexual encounters, but that it is all too similar to them. She writes, perhaps the wrong of rape has proved so difficult to define because the unquestionable starting point has been that rape is defined as distinct from intercourse, while for women, it is difficult to distinguish the two under conditions of male dominance. That's McKinnon. I come along and say, all right, no, no, we can't go that way. Okay? Because, for one, I say women empirically can tell the difference between consensual heterosexual sex and rape. Okay? It's one of the things I read about in my book. There is a difference in this experience. So to say that there's not really contradicts women's lived experience. Also, I note that if you go down this route, you undermine the theoretical possibility of women's sexual agency. And I'm not the first one to argue against McKinnon. In fact, I'm sort of jumping on a bandwagon here. In McKinnon's world, it's hard to understand how women could have agency as women. Although she doesn't go the route that you have to become unwomen. She never resolves it, really. But as woman, you are subordinate. And that really raises the question, like, how do women ever occur to themselves to maybe try not to be subordinate? McKinnon can't really explain that. Okay, so this is what I write. In reducing the violence of rape to the violence inherent in compulsory heterosexuality, McKinnon falls prey to theoretical dichotomies that ultimately cannot hold. The first clue to the weakness of her position is that it renders virtually all heterosexuality misogynistic. Boom, we're done. While noting this implication does not, in and of itself, constitute a sufficient argument against this theory, it does ring some fairly serious warning bells. And if we're to give women's experience any credence in a theory of rape, it must be acknowledged that for most women, in most cases, to be raped is a strikingly different experience than to engage in voluntary heterosexual sex. Even women who are involved in relationships that have consistently included forced sex can, for the most part, conceive of heterosexual encounters that are enjoyable and centered around their sexual pleasure. Okay, and then I go on at some length to describe how McKinnon's approach leads to undesirable theoretical results, the virtual impossibility of female heterosexual agency, but also relies on theoretical and plausible assumptions, such as an overly simplistic understanding of power dynamics. But what I want to focus in on here is the point that Gavey calls me to task on. And that's my claim that women can tell the difference. And notice I stated it pretty strongly. Right? The difference between consensual heterosexual sex and experiences of violence. Gavey says I'm wrong about that. And I become convinced that actually she's probably right. And she has a strong theoretical argument that she also has it backed up by qualitative psychological research interviews with women. Okay, so Gavey comes along and says this: many women have talked to me about experiences that they didn't call rape, but which I find difficult to see as just sex. Her book is called Just Sex, the Cultural Scaffolding of Rape. And she's playing on this notion of was it merely sex and was it ethical sex? Back to Gavey. They include stories of situations in which a man applied pressure that fell short of actual or threatened physical force, but which the woman felt unable to resist, as well as encounters where a man was rough and brutish, and the woman described letting sex happen because she felt unable to stop it. They also include stories of situations where a male partner was not directly coercive at all, but where the woman nevertheless found herself going along with sex that was neither desired nor enjoyed because she did not feel it was her right to stop it or because she did not know how to refuse. All of these accounts in different ways point to a complex gray area between what we might think of as mutually consenting sex on the one hand and rape or sexual coercion on the other. The narratives that Gavey presents are varied, they're complex, her subjects often struggle to put words to their experience. In many cases, the interviewees seem compelled to deny explicitly that their experience constitutes sexual violence. In fact, Gavey describes this as perhaps one of the few preventive strategies that women have against sexual violence, not terming it sexual violence, if that follows. If we don't call it rape, then I wasn't raped. Okay. But just to be clear, she does not consider many of these acts rape or even sexual violence. Well, I'm going to argue that she considers them unjust sex. Okay? Sexual encounters that are ethically dubious. Because after all, and this is interesting that we haven't really, in our theories, come across this, we tend to think that it's only rape or sexual violence that's unethical. surely there are other ways that sexual interactions that can happen that might not be just. They might not be criminal either, but they may not be ethical. Interesting that we've sort of become mired. It's either consensual, in which case it's totally okay, or it's violence, in which case it's totally wrong and criminal. We don't think about a lot of phenomena in this sort of. Okay. So I want to take Gaby at her word, and because she's convinced me that heterosexual women sometimes, perhaps often, have heterosexual interactions that exist in a kind of gray area between consensual sex and rape. I want to call these unjust sex. Not only is her empirical evidence convincing on the point, but it seems intuitively correct as well. You know, one thing that fascinates me about our culture's approach to sexuality and sexual interactions is the demand for clarity. This is one of the problems with consent theory. Well, did you consent or not? You know, that might be a fair question if we brought up girls and women with really rich language and really rich sense of their own sexual topography and helped them develop good decision-making processes so they could really tell, but we don't. So then we demand this clarity from them, from ourselves, that is completely contrary to our experience. That's very weird. Okay. So I find Gaby's gray sex area very related to McKinnon's. But Gaby also doesn't make some of McKinnon's mistakes. Okay, so I want to detail a little bit ways in which they overlap and ways in which they differ. So first, Gaby's work resonates with McKinnon's insofar as it raises the question of the relationship between sexual violence and what I'm going to call heteronormative sex. Okay, so and by that I mean dominant forms of heterosexual interaction. Common sort of mainstream kind of thing. Gaby uses the metaphor scaffolding to describe how sexual experiences that are viewed as quite common and normal under the current construction of heterosexuality are in fact supportive of a rape culture. Central to this scaffolding are what Gaby terms the male sexual drive discourse and the have-hold discourse. So the male sexual drive discourse is this dominant sense in our culture that men have insatiable sexual needs, you know, barely controllable, and they're constant and ongoing and, you know, serious. And the have-hold discourse that tells women you need to give sex in order to maintain relationships or to get some other kind of social good. You get it to have and hold. So one of the ways in which we frame normative heterosex is that sexuality for women is kind of a bartering chip. Why do you have it? Not because you want it, but because you want what it can get you. Not that what it can get you can be quite valuable. Intimacy, a relationship, a baby, social and political standing. There's lots of things it can get you, but it's usually not an end in and of itself. If you want to hear about some great sex ed, because a lot of this I think comes down to what we teach in sex ed. A lot of what we teach in sex ed is that, you know, you can get a disease and you can die. Usually people don't die from having sex. I mean, it's actually it's fairly uncommon, right? And just the biology stuff. If you want a great, just short read on what we could do differently, there was a New York Times Magazine article in the last couple of years. A gay Quaker guy teaching in a Catholic school, sex ed. And the theme of the sex ed is, how would we teach sex ed if we wanted our children to have great sex? What if we started from there? So he's this gay guy teaching like, yeah, that position doesn't really work that well. Good luck. But, you know, we found you might want to try something different. And the health stuff comes in. Because, you know, one way to have great sex is not to worry about getting sick or pregnant. But it's not avoiding death. You know? It's very weird. You avoid death. Okay. All right, so Gaby is saying this is all going on. This sounds like McKinnon. This sounds like McKinnon. Aggression, right? Structuring women as bartering. This is very McKinnon-like. Both terms echo, both this male sexual drive discourse and the have-hold discourse, both terms echo McKinnon's description of a constructed male heterosexuality marked by aggression, with female sexuality constructed as a kind of bartering tool that has value only to the extent to which it aligns with male desire. In fact, in many ways under this rubric, female sexual desire evaporates. We teach girls to the extent that we do when to say yes or no. We don't teach them, how do you know to figure out what you want? How do we figure that out? Female sexual desire just evaporates. Heterosexual women are encouraged to view their sexuality not as a good in and of itself, but rather as something that can be traded for other goods. This is the way in which I think Gaby and McKinnon are in sync. Here's the difference. Gaby writes, these everyday, taken for granted normative forms of heterosexuality work as a cultural scaffolding for rape. They support it. They help make it coherent. Okay? This is not to say that these normative forms of sex are rape, or that they are the same as rape. Okay, so mistake number one that McKinnon made, Gaby's not making. These are not the same. They're related, but they're not identical. And it is certainly not to say that all or much of everyday sex between men and women is rape-like. Even the most gender stereotypically conformist patterns of sex might have nothing in common for the particular woman and particular man involved with the experience of rape. Just wanted to draw this distinction. Not does she articulate this distinction, but she creates a theoretical model, particularly of power, that accounts successfully for it. And in this way develops a theory that is distinctly superior to McKinnon's. What allows Gaby to avoid the pitfalls of McKinnon's theory is precisely her more robust and nuanced approach to desire. See, in McKinnon, desire, feminine sexual desire was completely constructed in the context of patriarchy. Okay, that was what it was. It's like it was completely overwhelmed by the political discourse. Gaby rejects that notion of power that would be able to account for that completely like determinate aspect, to something much more nuanced. For McKinnon, women as women were sexual beings for whom male sexual aggression was erotically appealing. Okay? That was the harm that was done to women under patriarchy. Tricking women into actually experiencing aggression as erotic. The sexual identities of women were defined by a misogynistic set of practices and norms, a model that made the question of feminine sexual desire philosophically moot. Gaby, on the other hand, rejects notions of power that are so rigidly defined in favor of a more subtle theory of social constructionism, and thus is capable of recognizing women as complex actors in a dynamic situation. So she's never going to say that women are totally reduced to the power dynamics. They have ways of resisting. They have ways of exceeding those power dynamics. The power dynamics doesn't catch them all in one big net and then turn them into something. It's much more active, it's much more dynamic. Therefore, Gaby's theory is much more capable than McKinnon's of accounting for the fact that heterosexual women can desire heterosexual sex in a way that is politically and ethically unproblematic. McKinnon could never explain to us how that could be possible. Gaby can. That's a huge leap forward. My insistence in Rethinking Rape that women could generally distinguish between instances of rape and consensual heterosex emanated from a philosophical position that refused to conflate all of heterosexuality with patriarchal discourse. I said, no, we're not going to do that. Given that Gaby's theory does not make that mistake, how does the empirical reality of the gray zone that she articulates affect my understanding of rape as embodied experience? Or, to put it another way, how do current politics of desire, which both Gaby and I take to be substantially influential, that is, our desires, I don't take desires to sound like innate, that's with me like untouched by social and political discourses. That's not true. I mean, we all are taught to desire certain things. Sometimes some of us take it up in different ways. But I don't consider it innocent or hardwired or anything like that. So how do current politics of desire, which both Gaby and I take to be substantially influential, although not determinative of heterosexual women's actual desires, intersect with current politics of sexual violence? The challenge here, which I'm only going to partially meet today, is to articulate a sexual ethics that is capable of simultaneously naming the continuity between a rape culture and the examples of unjust sex that Gaby provides without conflating the two entirely, and without rendering feminine heterosexual desire as necessarily problematic. I'm not going to get all that done today, sorry. But that's sort of the larger project. I'm going to be part of it. I move forward in this analysis then with two assumptions: that unjust sex is a broader category of unethical sexual acts that may well encompass both rape and the kinds of experiences described by Gaby's interviews. Not conflate them, but may encompass both. and then attempt to determine what is wrong about unjust sex, and that's what I'm going to try to do. That's the part I'm going to try to do today. What is exactly wrong about unjust sex? Doing that will provide insight into the phenomenon of sexual violence without exhausting its meanings or the harms it imposes. So, now we've got a question. What exactly is wrong with these examples of unjust sex? The coercion. It's not as strong as coercion. Gaby gives examples like women say, well, okay, if I just have sex right now, then I'll get to sleep 20 minutes sooner. I'll do that. Or a variety of cases where she felt pressure, not to the level of coercion, but didn't really feel that she had the position or the language to say no. And might have even said yes, because the no didn't seem possible. What's wrong? So, let's consider desire, because we could go that way. We could say, what's wrong about all these cases is that the women at the beginning did not want to have sex. That's what's wrong. And the person knew that and kept going anyway. And that ethical sex should always start with both people wanting. Now, this is pretty tempting. It's a lot better than consent, right? Because consent always had that taint of you don't really want it, so we're going to have to sign you on the dotted line. Because you'll have the surgery because you want the tumor out. But if you had your druthers, someone wouldn't take a knife to your gut and take something out, right? So you have to consent, and it's risky. Consent frames heterosex as necessarily opposed to women's interests. Desire doesn't, so it's tempting. Because we say, okay, women might want this. Miracle of miracles, right? You might actually seek it out. Okay. So that's why I'm tempted, but I don't think it's going to work. And I don't think it's going to work for two reasons. First of all, recent scholarship in sexology argues against it. So, since 2000, there's been some really interesting, although they should be reading more philosophy because that'll make them go faster, but work on the difference between men and women's sexual desires. It's going increasingly sophisticated, not sophisticated enough. But the first sort of impulse in here is that when we were looking at sexual dysfunction in sexologists, it was assumed that one should have desire before the sex that happens. And if you don't, then you had a problem that needed some sort of pharmaceutical or other way to fix it. But then women, feminist sexologists started getting in there and they said, yeah, except that model of desire first and then sex is actually masculinist. It's assuming that men's experience holds true for everybody. Many women have the experience of what's called responsive and not spontaneous arousal. Let me read from someone who started this. Sensing an opportunity to be sexual, the partner's neediness, or an awareness of one or more potential benefits or rewards that are very important to them, but not necessarily sexual, women move from a sexual neutrality to seeking stimuli necessary to ignite sexual desire. Desire. Okay? This sexual desire would be experienced as a craving for sexual sensations for their own sake. It might also involve a desire to experience physical and subjective arousal. We should talk about the difference between physical and sexual arousal. It's really interesting. And perhaps release of sexual tension. Sexual desire, then, is a responsive rather than a spontaneous event. This is not true for all women. Okay, plenty of women experience spontaneous arousal, but there is a marked difference in rates of spontaneous and responsive arousal between heterosexual men and women. So if we were to say, well, real sex starts with having desire, then again, women get to find out of sexuality. But these sexologists said we don't have to do that, we just have to complicate our notions of desire and understand that it can be responsive. Okay, there's a lot that's problematic about this research. First of all, they take categories like female and males, if those are obvious, and they map them onto men and women. That's a problem too. Occasionally, very rarely, does the research turn to transgender individuals and problematize these categories, but that's a problem too. Moreover, the scholarship seems more focused on identifying rather than explaining differences between men and women in terms of sexual desire. But even with all of these limitations, there's much to be gleaned from these empirical studies. Of particular interest to our current discussion is the notion of desire as frequently responsive rather than spontaneous. If this is the case, then requiring desire prior to any sexual interaction will ethically delegitimize experiences that are common and ethically unproblematic among women. Okay, so that's my first problem with desire. If we say you've got to have desire first, then there's a whole set of experiences that are very common to women that we're all of a sudden calling wrong. And intuitively, it doesn't seem to me that those ought to be considered wrong. It doesn't seem to me that the notion of responsive sexual desire is ethically problematic. So in fact, it would be masculinist. It would be sexist to say you have to have the desire first before you have the sex. The second problem that I have with this is that it seems clear to me that desire is more complex than that rather simple formulation may indicate. Working from a model of the self that I've come to call embodied intersubjectivity, I would argue that framing desire as something that an individual has or doesn't have, and as something whose existence must be established prior to a particular sexual encounter, is an overly atomistic approach. It's like social contract theory brought to sex. That's what it really is. Like, who am I? I'm over here, all by myself. I am my own being. I check in, what are my desires, and then I enter into an alliance, right, for mutually beneficial needs with another atomistic person. And as long as we're all sort of distinct and okay, then it's ethical. I just don't think that's the way we live. It's not the theory of the self that I'm developing. When I talk about embodied intersubjectivity, I want to say that central to our existence and our identity as human beings is one that we're embodied. It's not like a layer that's just laid down on top of our real selves. It's part of who we are. That's why I argue against objectification. Because if we say, oh, it's bad to be treated like an object, we forget that we are objects, that we are material, that we are acted on, and that there's nothing wrong with that. Okay? Intersubjectivity, who we are, always is in relation. We don't exist in that atomistic little, hermeneutically sealed, here is me, here is my existence, always in relation to others in different ways, and in movement, and in motion too. So that notion of check in with everyone's desire, see who they are separate before they come together, I found really counterintuitive. That's not how desire works. Desire is always a being with. Repulsion is a being with, for that matter. Okay? It's always in relation. So if we go towards embodied intersubjectivity, we can understand desire as something that a sexual interaction can bring into being, can create, as the research by sexologists demonstrates. All right, we're not out of the woods yet, though, because that still raises some important and troubling philosophical questions. For example, the fact that desire can be incited by a sexual interaction doesn't mean that the desire is always desired. Sometimes we might desire not to desire, right? And this could be a really important ethical question in a case where one person does not desire and resents the actions of another to try to create desire, particularly relevant in long-term relationships, where a high degree of sexual familiarity could result in a degree of certainty that action X could cause the other person to desire further sexual interaction, and exploitation, perhaps, of the corporeal generosity explored so effectively by Rosamund Pros. Moreover, and more obviously central to the question of sexual violence, if desire is intersubjectively generated, then we can no longer argue that all sexual interactions must begin with a situation of mutually felt desire. That is, we can imagine an ethically acceptable sexual interaction where one person feels desire, another does not, but one person, either partner really, interacts with the other with the express purpose of creating mutually felt desire. Such a scenario, I would argue, does not necessarily constitute an act of unjust sex. So all of those things that Gabe was talking about, the ethical problem cannot be necessarily or exhausted by the attempt to try to create desire, because that is not always unethical. So we're still left with asking, what's wrong about these situations? It's not that desire was absent. We've already figured out that that's sometimes okay. It's not even necessarily in the attempt to create desire. That might sometimes be ethically problematic, but it's not always. So we're still left with, what is wrong about these? Katie herself points out, by the way, that it's impossible to imagine acts of sexual interaction where one person does not feel any desire, but willingly engages sexually with the other out of generosity or some other impetus. She says, I don't think it's necessary to propose instead an ethic that holds all sex to be entered into because both people feel like having sex. It seems possible to imagine legitimate instances where people choose to have sex with someone as an act of giving, even though they don't feel like a physical experience themselves. It is interesting to note that we do this all the time. One way we can understand rape is a furious attempt to overcome that, to say, damn it, I'm not going to be affected by this person. I'm going to be the one in charge. What I want is going to be the only thing that determines what happens. I'm going to overcome this person. It doesn't entirely work. Hegel helps us understand this, right? Because you're not completely autonomous as a rapist, because you need a victim to be a rapist. If you haven't got someone to overcome, you can't be the victor. There's always that resentment that it's never complete. It's never complete because we're intersubjective beings. Okay. While not utterly successful, this attempt to eliminate intersubjectivity constitutes a serious ethical harm. In an appropriately intersubjective interaction among human persons, the quality of the interaction is affected by all the parties involved. Okay? Everyone's got some skin in the game. Everyone's vulnerable and affected and affecting. It's a dynamic. It's not reducible to any one subject. That complex dynamic can include the generation of sexual desire and the generation of sexual repulsion. But what marks the ethical acceptability of any engagement, I would argue, is not the presence or absence of desire, but rather the recognition of the parties involved of the relevance and the efficacy of that desire. Not whether it's there, but does it matter? Does it have any standing? Can it affect things? Can it be at work? Katie alludes to this. Here's one of her descriptions. Both Chloe and Pat describe patterns of sex in these relationships in which their bodies themselves became objectified. As they acted under a sense of obligation to be the body, the woman that they understood their partner wanted and expected. They sort of lost their phenomenological sense of their own body and just tried to produce the subject that was desired by their partner. Within these relational dynamics, and the sexual moments more particularly, are clear indicators of the lack of necessity of women's desire and pleasure, because its absence was able to go unquestioned and unnoticed. It just didn't matter that she didn't want it. It was innocuous. It didn't affect what was going to happen. It didn't have a seat at the table, and it didn't have standing. There was no take-up. There was no uptake. It is the unquestioned and unnoticed nature of the absence of women's desire, and not the absence of desire itself, that I find to be the core of the ethical difficulty in these examples. What provides a link, and I have not done the work yet of the distinction, but what provides a link between these gray areas and more clear-cut cases of sexual violence is the failure to both understand and live sexual interactions as necessarily rooted in women's sexual intersubjectivity. Acquiescence is different from generosity. To give in is distinct from giving. The former of these two pairs indicate a lack of ability to affect the situation. One only acquiesces to that which one cannot change. One only gives in when one cannot change the terms of the negotiation. If one is recognized as generous, one's intersubjective efficacy is also recognized. It doesn't come out in pretty ways. It doesn't come out in efficient ways. It doesn't come out in organized ways. It doesn't come out in complete paragraphs with nicely constructed sentences. And a lot of times what that unspoken needs is just some space to get thrown out there in all its messiness. But in a classroom situation where one really cares about, for example, getting students fluent in a certain field of the body, you can't let that have too much space because it will overwhelm us in its chaos. It will overwhelm us in its visceral power over us. So I try to think of it in terms of a rhythm. I need to give some space to that chaotic, unprocessed, just let me say it somewhere and stuff. And then I need to come back and say, one of the things that feminist theory gives us are some anchors, are some poles around which to start organizing these inchoate feelings and sensations and worries and guilt and a lot of other things. We can start talking about them in terms of theoretical concepts. I try to frame that as a grounding, as a topography. Just like getting the lay of the land. This stuff helps to get the lay of the land. But it's a difficult balance. Oh, sorry, Jenny.
Eve.
Oh, I found your talk really interesting. For a good 20 years, I've been involved in what we call our special hearing board, which adjudicates cases of sexual assault on campus. And I mean, there's the sort of semi-legal aspect of it where you have to make definitions, which we can make as a campus, that are not those of the legal system. But a different side to this, and it doesn't help much with adjudication, but it might help thinking about that, is what I have seen over the years is that nobody brings these cases forward. Maybe.
To think about this, I'm trying to think like what would be some remedies to unjust sex? Like if there are these unethical interactions, how would we remedy them? And I'm starting more and more to think about the notion of sexual fluency as an important remedy, and how much sexual disfluency we have. And it's because of the incredible sexual disfluency that we have that it's often a cruel thing to say to a person who's been the victim of sexual violence. Did you say yes? Did you want it? What were your intentions? Because really, how often are we ever that clear? I mean, sometimes we're very clear. Sometimes we're crystal clear. But don't we all have a lot of situations where we're torn and we're not sure what we want? We maybe can't even get access to what we want precisely because of the political situation, I would argue in this case, because of the political institution of heterosexuality. And because of those webs. Because every interaction is not just an interaction. It affects your identity and existence in a variety of relationships. We still have the case in higher education in the United States that a rape victim is much more likely to transfer. And is still much more likely. The community becomes hostile to someone who dared to say, this happened to me, it was not okay. Very rarely are people accused of rape, sometimes, but rarely ostracized in the same way. The network of relationships. But how are we gonna figure out how to talk about desire? We're gonna get a lot more comfortable about a lot of different things. And I do think, and maybe I'm a little closer to McKinnon than I'd like to admit, I do think that we can't even talk about desire until we really start undermining compulsory heterosexuality. Because as soon as the compulsory comes first, it's going to be really hard to teach girls and women how to figure out what they want, what they like, how to value experimentation, how to say sometimes you don't know what you want. Here's some situations under which you might want to try something out and then find out, oh yeah, not for me, okay. Not to mention to know how a sense of sexual becoming rather than a sense of fixed identities. This is who I am. In my other thinking about this, I articulate some different wrongs of sex work. They're a little bit different than some of the other feminist theories. But I end up saying that what's wrong about sex work is also wrong about things like Match.com. Same wrong. Who am I? I am a person who wants someone of this gender identity and this height and this ethnic background and this degree and who loves their job. I have a laundry list. That's not intersubjective. That's me. It's like, making your own doll or something, and just waiting for someone to come along and fit it. That's not intersubjective at all. We understand our desires as coming out of particular relationships. Right? Not checking off a list. So I'm ready to say that that's unethical too.
Can I ask you about the term compulsive? Oh, sorry.
I asked Jen to moderate, and then I'm just calling on people.
These people know how to, get in there.
I didn't even give her a chance to comment. The term compulsive heterosexuality. Compulsory heterosexuality. So Is that a simple term with the contrast being with
Most people
heterosexual?
take it from Adrian Rich's really foundational text, Compulsory Heterosexuality. So it is a complex term. It is a term that names the social privileging and policing of heterosexuality as virtually the only valid sexual identity that social subjects
As opposed to what are
as opposed to not only homosexuality, but also bisexuality. The categories are now proliferating. There's pansexuality. Adrian Rich wasn't talking about trans folk, and of course trans is very different than sexual orientation, but I think she would link the two, so that, and I think in her analysis she does link the binary, the gender binary, to compulsory heterosexuality. So the need to fit into a very clear gender box, and that part of that gender box is attraction to the opposite gender box, and the reifying and the policing of both those boxes and the attraction. So it is complex. But it's a notion of heterosexuality not as a set of individual practices, but as a political institution that's valued. You get stuff for it. That's one thing.
Could I follow up?
Yeah.
So, clearly, there's historically, what you're saying is true. There's been compulsory heterosexuality. But don't you think, A, it's beginning to break down, and B, that even historically, it's much more compulsory for men than for women?
On the first answer, yes, but I'm not sure on the first question, I'm not sure it's breaking down as much as
Breaking down is probably too strong.
I think it's too strong. It's eroded. It's weakening.
Yeah.
And in fact, I would argue that the pace of the weakening has started to accelerate rather quickly
That's
in the
my
last
sense.
couple of years. So it's not even, it's definitely, we're catching up on, for example, the ethical challenges that trans folk face much more quickly.
What's the year of I kissed a girl and I liked her? There's a good date time to pick.
Yeah, although that's a little bit more problematic example, because one thing that's interesting, and I don't know if this is maintaining, is the cooptation of particularly lesbianism for phallocentric heterosexuality, which we don't see the reverse of. So we've had lesbianism stand in as somehow part of phallocentric heterosexuality. So Howard Stern had lesbians making out, and that's fine and hot. It's very strange. Women, heterosexual women, don't tend to like, or we're not taught to like gay guys making out as part of our porn, but lesbians have been part of male-centric porn for quite a while. And I think I Kissed a Girl was part of that. Especially because I kissed a girl and I kind of liked it. Next line, hope my boyfriend doesn't mind it. Something like that. Right back into that meaning. Nevertheless, I still think that the erosion that you're talking about is happening. And in fact, I have a perhaps too optimistic, sunny view of things like the amendment, the constitutional amendment that my state, North Carolina, recently passed, banning same-sex marriage. And on one hand, this is terrible. 61%, from my view, 61% of North Carolinians who voted in that election voted to write into the state constitution ban of same-sex marriage. And on one hand, terribly distressing. On the other hand, you don't do that unless you know you're losing. It's the death throes. So I think it is a road. I lost your second question.
The second question was whether, it's my sense that
men, right.
Yeah, that the opposition, the compulsory heterosexuality is even more of a force for males than it is for women, and that's been true for quite some time.
I would argue that it is not more, but that it's framed completely differently. That certainly compulsory heterosexuality places the expectation for lots and lots of sexual partners and constantly reaffirming one's heterosexuality on them. So men's heterosexuality I find to be much more in need of policing. Go and watch some old episodes of Friends. They're always terrified of people thinking that they're gay. And there's so many different ways in which they may show up as being gay. Like, boy, you've got to be really careful or else you might be seen as gay. This is not something that heterosexual women worry that much about. Heterosexual women can hold hands, call them sweetheart, use high voices, huggy, all this stuff, and no one's going to think, wow, they might be lesbian. So on the one hand, the policing is different. On the other hand, I think it's just as central to dominant femininity for a woman to be heterosexual as it is for a man. For a woman to adopt a lesbian identity is a deep threat to her femininity and to her status as a woman in the heterosexual political discourse. But it's very different. Part of the reason that lesbianism isn't seen as much of a possibility, why we don't think of women holding hands and kissing each other hello and calling each other sweetheart and darling, I mean, we don't immediately think lesbians, is because, frankly, lesbian sexuality doesn't make all that much sense from the dominant heterosexual paradigm, which is, as opposed to male homosexuality, which actually, I would argue, is more coherent. I had a friend of mine ask me once, this a long time ago, don't think too badly of him, but he said, yeah, what do lesbians do? And I think it was an authentic question, because what could those bodies do together that could possibly constitute sex? It's sort of a contradiction in terms. Whereas men, we may not like it, we might want to police it, we might want to call it repulsive and something to be scared of, but we know what it would look like. Right? Not to mention that it has a really, if you start reading in our metaphysics at all, you're going to come across it too. It's written into our literature in a way that lesbianism doesn't have as much of a presence. It's there, but it's not as much of a presence. So I would reject the claim that it's more compulsory for men than it is for women. I would say that the compulsory nature plays out very differently. Men are always supposed to want sex, right? This is why we never ask about whether men consented to sex. They're men. Notice that leaves men in a very similar situation to what I was describing women. We don't teach men. How do you know what you want? Under what circumstances? How can you figure that out? No. You always want it. There's just good sex and better sex. I mean, sex is just by definition good, we say men. And we don't leave them with any fluency either. We teach women, well, you're not supposed to want it, but you got to do it. So in the most traditional sense, it's keep them off, get married, now you got them. I mean, good Lord, there's no room for pleasure in that. Right? Gatekeeper to duty-bound wife. So in that sense, women's sexuality, I think, is just fundamentally constructed as less coherent.
Is there, well, I'll have Jeff ask the question, but any students who are here that are wanting to ask a question, because those philosophers will dominate everything.
I just watched a documentary, I'm not sure if you've seen it, called The Invisible War, about rape and sexual assault in the military, and it's quite disturbing. But it talks a lot about how these cases just either don't ever make it to the military court once they're there, they're just not prosecuted. So it seems sort of to be, to me, while you were talking, I was thinking it was kind of the opposite of what you're talking about, having this sort of rhetoric of, a just or an ethical sex. And I guess I'm wondering how, especially in that system, it just seems so black and white. Like, did you consent? And it doesn't even really matter if you consented or not in these military trials. They just kind of get swept under the rug. But how, what room, I guess, I'm trying to form, how would we go about kind of implementing this?
That's just an incredibly difficult question, how it would show up in legal theory. There are a few things I've gotten clear about. For example, the Brown-Miller approach that I described, where rape was not about sex, it was all about violence, remember that? That got written into some legal code about rape in actually some pretty damaging ways. In such cases, some states just took out the category of rape and sexual violence, just like a punch in the face. So let's just call it a punch in the face. And as soon as it's written out, the particularity can't be spoken. Those harms that you were talking about, there's no legal language. Legal language is incredibly artificial, right? It's incredibly scripted, and there was no way to get that across. So I'm clear that at least we have to understand why sexual violence needs to have its own category, has its own specific harms. Where my theory really gets tricky, first of all, is the consent. If I say consent doesn't work, I don't think it does. What am I willing to replace it? I'm not a legal theorist. So I just don't know. I need someone to do that. And it's also really difficult because my approach to rape and sexual violence really honors sexual difference. One of the ways in which I take up our embodied beings is a Rigorine approach to bodies, which is there is no neutral body, there's no human body, right? Bodies are always and already different from each other, and that matters. I am not interested at all in any analysis that says this rape is worse than this rape. You know, that's just silliness and doesn't get us anywhere. But I do think that one's gender identity changes the meaning of rape, depending on your social and political context. So I don't think the boys that were raped by Catholic priests are having exactly the same experience, or even having the exact set of harms that the women who are getting date raped on their college campuses are. There may be some overlaps, but I don't want to talk about the differences to honor the particularity. I don't know how to get that into the legal code either, because our legal code does not like that kind of thing. It certainly doesn't like distinguishing people, I mean, allegedly. It likes the illusion of neutrality. It's rarely served them well, but it likes the illusion of the person before the law and the blindfold. Right? So how we translate this, and not only into our laws, into our judicial practices on college campuses. And how much of a burden can we put when we're not doing the education? When we're not teaching sexual fluency? How much can we require of our sexual subjects? So very difficult question.
And then I'll go back to Judge. Go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
I think I sort of related questions when Katie was speaking about the role of consent. And it seems like one of the advantages of consent, not to speak for consent after your talk, but is that it's public, right? Sometimes it can be public, and desire can often be private. Not always,
Yeah.
but sometimes.
Yeah.
And what I guess what I'm thinking about is that the issue of adjudication is not only legal, right? It should be ethical as well, and available to not just the person who's wrong, but also the person who's wronging. And as a male, I'm trying to think about how it all plays out for me, right? Not that marriage doesn't change that, and distinguishing between acquiescence and generosity seems epistemically tricky.
Yes.
And so, the advantage of consent is that I sort of know it when I see it. Right?
Yeah,
I
certainly.
do. At this point, with my wife. I do.
Okay. That's been problematized in the literature too, but okay.
Whether there's desire for desire seems much more difficult for me to forecast.
Yes.
You know, can you speak to how am I to sort of avail myself of this new paradigm of sexual ethics?
Yeah, and it's a layered problem, isn't it? Because there's at least two problems. One, how do I know the other person's desire, right? They're going to have to tell me. How do they do that? How do I hear it? Am I able to hear it? Are they speaking a language that I speak? Right? Will they? Under what circumstances will they? So there's when you say that consent is public in a way that desire is not. At first I said, I don't know about that. And I said, oh, I see. Consent is only consent if it's public.
Right.
I can't consent privately. It's only consent if I actually express it in some way. I might do it not quite as efficaciously as I could, or I might do it ambiguously, but it's not consent until it's expressed. Whereas I can be feeling desire and no one can know about it, right? Like the maker, very handy sometimes. So, right, desire is private. So there's the how do we articulate desire? But then there's an even deeper question which I come to. Before I can communicate desire, however I do communicate it, I have to be fluent with my own desire, right? I mean, it's not only getting out there, I have to know what desire feels like, I have to know whether to trust it, I have to know, oh, this is an unusual place for me to feel desire, let's figure that out a little bit, or, yeah, this is the way it's going, time to get a train out of the station. And that demands some personal sexual fluency. So there's at least two problems, and feminist philosophers give themselves license to imagine quite beyond the realm of what is currently possible. We are good at none of that. right now. I mean, we are really actually actively bad at both of those things. So this is a pretty high bar I'm standing, right? And part of, and I've dealt with this in a different paper, I've tried to talk about sexual disfluency and sexual fluency and how this is going to be a practice that we're going to have to undertake to get better at it. I don't think it's either doing it or not doing it. I think it's a question of getting good at it. I think it's a question of a practice skill. And we live in a culture where there's a ton of sexual images, but not much active, critical, careful, humane sexual discourse. So the weird thing is, we see a lot of things that look like what passes for sexuality, but we don't talk about it. And we don't give people the skills who are entering into these relationships that they need to talk about. So it's a bit utopian. But it's a better discussion to have, I would argue, even if we're not good at it right now, than the discussion of consent. I really think it's a better set of questions to ask than, will you give in? Is it okay if I do this to you? I mean, the whole framework of consent is just, I find so problematic.
Oh, okay. Can I have Taylor go before me? Yeah, Taylor.
So, this is kind of sound like kind of a funny question, but I think 50 Shades of Grey just like became like the worldwide like best-selling book. So, like, as a feminist thinker, I'm just like asking your personal opinion on it, and then kind of how that ideology affects like the way that you describe like the unjust sex area, like the gray area.
Right.
Because like, do you think that's more of like a fluid, like a progressive thing that can change? Do you think things like 50 Shades of Grey like changes that, or like maybe goes against what you're trying to work towards?
So I have to admit I haven't read it, so I've only read summaries of it. So I'm speaking from less about 50 Shades of Grey than how 50 Shades of Grey is represented in mainstream dominant discourse. It does not signal to me a great new horizon of female sexual agency. And there's a set of feminist thinkers who, and they do some good work and they make some really important points. I'm not dismissing them, but are sort of along the whole lines like anything that's transgressive is progressive. And I find that pretty sloppy. And I don't think everything that is transgressive is necessarily progressive and necessarily. I understand why something like 50 Shades of Grey could gain momentum and be very commonly read. One, because there's so little erotica that's written at all for women in mind. And two, because we needed to take something like, certainly we needed to take something like vulnerability out of sex in order to make it ethical. I was about to say power, and I'm still thinking about that. So maybe we don't even have to take power out of sexuality to make it ethical. I'm not sure. So I can understand some of this sort of flirting with S&M and dominance and something as a sort of creating a very defined space in which we can actually engage directly with positions of power. So I can sort of go down the line. But then really I just think this really betrays some of my deep unphilosophical commitments. I just have a hard time seeing the value in being heard. It's just like, can we just, I don't know, I don't think we should be like, I'm theoretically committed to exploring things like BDSM as interesting sites of sexual interaction and maybe risk-taking. But in my heart of hearts, I think it would be better if we encourage women not to hurt themselves or let other people hurt them. So there's sort of a fundamental commitment there. Like, it's not the, maybe we can get there eventually and it could be sort of interesting, but right now there's way too much of people getting hurt. So I don't tend to see it as a great step forward for women's sexual agency. Some of the conversations about birth control in response to some really incredibly reactionary right-wing things, I actually see are much more promising. But 50 Shades of Grey is, every 5 or 10 years there comes a book like this. It's not always erotica, but there's usually every 5 or 10 years there's a dominant book that tries to reinscribe traditional gender roles. So the last time it was The Rules. Remember that? And then behind, it's like every once in a while someone comes up and says, actually, what will make you happy is being a submissive wife. Oh, newsflash. I'm like, oh yeah, we've never heard that in Western life. It's a great new theory, and here's what you do. In the 1980s, it was Fascinating Womanhood. Yeah, same book. Different author, same thing. Just keep it around. Doesn't work, doesn't make women happy.
Okay, so I guess I guess I have a small clarificatory question that may indicate whether I have a bigger clarificatory question. So just to make sure I have straight, so there's sort of like two basic mental states that are key here, right? One is the second order desire, but then second is the recognition of the relevance and efficacy of those desires, right?
Correct.
And just so both of those, though, are intersubjective states. They're not states of, say, either a partner as individuals.
I would argue that that's
Okay. So then what I guess my bigger question I'm just curious about is, so on one hand we've got the McKinnon position, which denies female agency because it's so heavily socially constructed.
Yeah.
Right? And on the other hand, you've got the position you're arguing for, like the embodied intersubjectivity. And you noted that this view is much more complicated and nuanced than the McKinnon view, right? And so it allows for female agency. But I'd like to hear more about how it does so, because I was a bit confused how, if these mental states that are important only arise through these interactions, doesn't that just provide these opportunities for the gray area cases where expectations and norms just sort of built so far into it that I'm curious, do these states ever actually represent individual agency as opposed to just taking the McKinnon problem and putting it in, say, a personal relationship, interpersonal relationship?
Right. And I think part of my answer is going to come in your use of create the opportunities.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Intersubjectivity is a model for human existence. Does not keep us from doing unethical things. In fact, it helps us explain how we can hurt each other quite drastically. Because I'm not self-protected, I am always vulnerable to the other, and the other doesn't always respect that vulnerability or engagement in a way that forwards my human flourishing. So when I talk about sexual interactions as essentially intersubjective, that doesn't mean they always go well, or that they don't involve harm, because they can, and they do. But in my approach of embodied subjectivity, one of the things I say is that I approach the body as central to human subjectivity and as simultaneously active and passive. So I really reject models of social constructionism that treat either the self or the body like a lump of Play-Doh. Not Play-Doh, that goes through the machine and comes out in shape. That just is acted on and is not also acting. So anytime we interact with systems of oppression, we're not only acted on by them, we're acting back. And I have a little with Judith Butler on this, right? Every repetition has a little possibility for resistance. The same system of oppression that acts on me is taken up a little bit differently by myself and by my body than when it's impacting someone else. So the notion of embodied intersubjectivity has this centrality of movement and dynamism that just precludes any determinism. So the self, in my mind, gets sort of described as a moving location, always in relation to other things. So it has a certain particularity that I'm still working out, because no one is located in exactly the same way. Right? So I'm from a big family. I'm the third of 9 children. Okay? I did not have the same parents as the youngest child. I was not raised by the same parents. I didn't have the same childhood. Okay? They may have been some sort of continuity, but the difference in location can be the difference in everything. And insofar as we're still moving, those interactions can change who we are, including our desires. Okay? So we can have a sexual interaction that's surprising, that if we had thought about it before, we would not have considered erotic at all, but we're surprised to find out actually pretty fun. We can't get any of that notion of being able to be changed when we have these reified ideas of sexual identity. This is what I like. This is what I, individually, like and enjoy. As if a relationship can't touch that. So that's why I think it's better than McKinnon. Because McKinnon cannot explain to me how that is even possible. And she can't explain how women could ever enjoy or desire any kind of heterosexual interaction, by definition. Nor can she explain feminism for that matter. I don't know why I never said that. But you can't explain feminism. If women are to come out of the Plato machine as complete products of patriarchy, how could they ever get distance on it to criticize it? Who's talking? I mean, unless you want to go the Monique Fatigue view, and say lesbians aren't women, but okay, and then you'd have to say feminists aren't women. And people say that, but no, they're silly. So, McKay just boxes you in. Embodied intersubjectivity keeps this openness and this wiggle room. That's not a guarantee, but it allows us to understand how we could move. And that's one of the things I'm looking for in a model. How can we move? Because we know we're moving, so we should be able to understand how that's possible.